r/AskReddit. Eerie towns, disappearing diners, and creepy gas stations. What's your true, unexplained story of being in a place that shouldn't exist? Part 4. A group of friends and I decided to take a small Saturday afternoon road trip into the backcountry of South Carolina. We figured we'd just drive around, head southwest, and see if we could find some antique shops, cemeteries, abandoned buildings and the like. We pile into my car and start driving. It's about an hour of nothing, just some light conversation and southern pine forests. We pass a few horse farms, some quaint old mill towns, and a few gas stations, but nothing interesting yet. 2 p.m. rolls around, and we decide we wanted to get something to eat. As a rule, we always like to try local diners and restaurants, so we kept driving until we saw a faded road sign for a town. It was about 5 miles down the road and we figured that's good enough. As we are driving through the town, we notice there's no one out. No cars on the roads, no people on the streets, and no real houses. The streets are lined with abandoned and boarded up warehouses, shops with broken windows, and a few broken down cars from the 90s. The further we go, the worse it gets. We finally get to a diner that's right off their main street. It looks like there's about 10 people eating inside, and there's a few cars in the parking lot. Seems like they're open. Here's where it starts to get weird. We open the door and step in. As soon as we clear the threshold, everyone stares at us. It's like in movies where the record scratches on the jukebox and everyone looks, except far more uncomfortable. In the middle of the diner is a large table with 6 people around it, who all turn back to their food and start whipsah-talking. The waitress nervously shuffles up to us and quietly asks how many. My friend Chris takes the lead and says 4 in just a normal speaking voice. Everyone looks at us again and the waitress, who looks barely older than 16, recoils, but takes us to our table. She sat us in a basic 4-top near the large table in the middle. She takes our drink orders and leaves. Once she goes, we all whisper about how weird that was. While we are talking, the line cook is just staring at us with this violent look in his eyes. We all figure out what we want and wait. We sit in awkward silence for about 10 minutes before the waitress comes back. She takes our orders and disappears into the back of the diner, leaving us alone in the dining room with the people at the other table. It gives us some time to look them over. They're a basic southern family. Chubby, haggard-looking wife. Husband with sun-lathered skin and oil stains on his coveralls. 3 children, all girls, all in nice Sunday dresses. And then her. The other woman was dressed like the younger girls, but looked very much in her 40s. She wore a red, paisley patterned dress, with frilled lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was long and stringy, and covered the bulk of her round face. To the left of her was a doll, seated in a high chair for babies. The woman would sometimes lean in towards the doll and whisper something, then giggle. Soon the waitress dropped food off at their table, but set a meal down for the doll too. She commented on how pretty the woman's daughter was and left. About 10 minutes later she came back with our food, silently left it, gave us the side and walked away. The waitress came back to refill the other table's water, where she asked everyone how the food was, but asked the doll too. When she asked the doll, she spoke in a baby voice. The woman then picked up the doll, held it in front of her face, and spoke in a little girl's voice. She was being the doll. My other friend looked at me with the most terrified, wide-eyed expression. She worked with disturbed children as a therapist in a court-mandated facility. We shoveled our mediocre food down, and my friend Chris just dumped $40 on the table and we left. As we were leaving the town, Chris was looking for any sort of town name. I was checking to make sure we weren't being followed. This happened about 6 years ago, and we still can't find that town. No one remembers the name, or the road it was off of, but we remember being there, and what the diner looked like. One time I was driving with a friend from St. Louis to Nashville, and both our phones died, and we got a little lost. Wound up driving through Cairo, Illinois. That whole town should not exist. It was surreal. Like driving through a Scooby-Doo ghost town. The buildings obviously were pretty great at the time, but now they are faded and falling apart. People were just haplessly milling about the streets like zombies. Freaky. Cairo, Illinois. I googled it and found a very interesting and sad article about the town. Ooh, I finally have one. I hope I'm not too late. I was staying at a friend's place in the financial district in New York City. They were out of town, so I was babysitting their cat. At some point in the late evening I realized I hadn't eaten dinner, so I went out to find something fast. Hurricane Sandy had recently come through, so many shops and restaurants were still closed and in recovery mode, so my search turned up nothing of interest. On my way back to the apartment to order delivery I walked by a place with a woman standing outside and she said free pizza. Now I'm not one to ever turn away from those words, so I turned to her and she repeated the phrase while opening the door to a small pizzeria. I went inside and sure enough there was free pizza. I ended up getting 2 large slices and headed back home for the night, stopping to give one to the doorman at the apartment complex. The next day I walked the entirety of the financial district and found absolutely no trace of this pizzeria. To this day I still call it my ghost pizza story. I've been living out of my car sometimes. There's a stretch of road in the southwest that runs along national forests. One night I was looking for a good dark pull-off to sleep in. I found a good one. It had trees to pull under so the headlights out on the 2 lane wouldn't be as disturbing as it has truck traffic. In the morning I heard a car pull off and watched as it went on past me into the forest on a 2-track. I hadn't seen that lane when it was dark. It looked inviting. I decided to try driving on it myself. It turned out to be a lovely area, and eventually I found a really nice spot under some trees out in there where it was very quiet and I could see the Milky Way at night, although it was sub-zero most nights. I stayed out there for several days. Data service was good, so I kept applying, and during that time I got an interview invitation, the first in a long time. They called while I was sitting under those trees. The guy who had called later told me that I had sounded very relaxed. Heartened by that call, I drove out to the highway to get some groceries and water. When I came back up the highway I could not find the original entry point. I found another 2-track and eventually got back to the same spot, but that lane had no place to pull off and park. Months later I took a temporary house about 40 miles from there and sometimes still use that stretch of highway. I look carefully every time I pass through, sometimes irritating other drivers. Have not yet found the original entry. None of the pull-offs have a lane at the back, or even a break in the fence, and none of the lanes have even a slight wide spot, much less a deep place with trees. I'm not that kind of person at all, which is why I re-examine that stretch every time I pass through, but I'm slowly resigning myself to having spent at least one night in a place that doesn't currently exist. Edit to follow up a bit. I never turn on location on. I'm sure the phone company does some tracking. Google Maps keeps prompting me to, but I never turn it on. Not that hard to enter 2 locations if I need a distance calc. It does not have a Play or Gmail account on it. Never logged in with it. I did use Google Tracks on another phone for trail marking years ago, but don't typically need that functionality for street driving. Also, I like getting lost. There is a finite stretch of road that this entry could be on. There are clear boundaries at each end. I'm guessing 10 miles. There are no landmarks to enter into a map program, and it is to be on one side of the road. There are several entries along that stretch. Many of them are gated. The ones I used had no gates or provision for gates, even pull gates, which I always look for, so I don't let cattle out. The original entry looked like a much worn road. My initial impression was that it was a party road or hunting road. Group of us are camping at a big state park with a bunch of horses. We had more people than horses, so my best friend and I go out riding just the 2 of us, then came back and switched out for the larger group to go. At the time we are in our early 20s, while everyone else on the trip is 30s 40s. They had made a bunch of jokes when we left about not getting lost because it got dark fast and we were in the middle of nowhere in the mountains. Which means of course, when they go out, they got lost. To make a long story short, one of the women forgot to mention she was on a few new medications and convinced the rest of the group to follow her down a steep deer trail. A different rider had had surgery and a green horse and had to bail off, and this all accumulated with them calling us to come save them. In the dark, in the middle of nowhere. They originally wanted us to bring a horse trailer, but neither of us have driven one before, and the ones we had were massive, so we take a car and go try and hunt them down. They said they'd found a road and dropped a pin in it on Google Maps, so off we went. The road was hidden off a highway. It's pitch black outside by now, and we can only see a few feet ahead of us. The road immediately turns to gravel and starts to shrink in size the more we go down it. Then it starts to go up and down increasingly steep hills. The whole time we are joking and laughing until we run across a house. It's one of those farmhouses you know shouldn't be inhabited because it looks like it's about to fall over. It's got barbed wire and shit all over the lawn and a dark figure watching us from porch the closer we approach. Cold been a person. Probably was a person, but like I said, it's dark. We managed to find our people, turn the car around, and get whoever needs to be in the car in it. My best friend and I take turns between driving and leading horses, with the car in front going slow, because shit is steep, the horses are tired and misbehaving, the riders are all upset at one another, and we know we are gonna have to take this whole parade on the highway, in the dark, because it's the only way back to camp. I never mentioned it to anyone, but the house wasn't there on the way back. A few years ago, I was driving home from Florida to Pennsylvania with 3 of my friends. It was late, probably sometime between 1 to 3 am, and we were somewhere in North Carolina. We needed gas soon, so we agreed to take the next exit off the highway that had a gas station. The second I took the exit, it was pitch black. There were no street lights along the exit ramp or on the roads up ahead. The only lights in the area came from my headlights and the lights from 95 behind us. The sheer darkness was enough to creep me out, especially because my vision isn't the best to begin with, but really sucks when it's dark. But we really needed gas, so we pressed on. While driving to the gas station, the only building we saw was a massive, old-looking church. We drove by a sign informing us that we were in a town, but there were no businesses or houses other than the church. When we finally got to the gas station, we saw an assortment of giant farm animal statues outside the building, standing tall and barely illuminated. They weren't fenced off, and there were no signs explaining why they were there, so if it is considered an attraction, it's a confusing one at best. However, the weirdest thing happened inside the gas station. With me on this trip was one other girl and 2 guys. We had all been friends for years, and our dynamic includes making fun of each other a lot, but never deliberately messing with each other's heads. At this point in our trip, we were all tired and eager to get home. The gas station itself was huge on the inside, filled to the brim with shelves, all of which were jam-packed with an assortment of junk food and junk items. In hindsight, this seems weird given how empty the town was, but at the time we were all distracted by just how much stuff this gas station held. The other girl and I went to the restroom, while the 2 guys paid for gas. The restroom were hard to get to as there were boxes piled just outside the door, and the sign just had a piece of paper with women scrawled across it in green highlighter. Upon leaving the restroom, we saw one of our friends entering the men's restroom, also marked by a piece of paper with men written in highlighter. He gave us a weird look as he entered, but we shrugged it off and walked towards our other friend, who we could see standing at a shelf a bit away. He was facing away from us, and as we approached I started to get a bad feeling in my stomach. As we got closer, he turned and gave us the most sinister look I've ever seen. Alarm bells are going off in my head at this point, and my female friend and I proceed to the car, unsure of what to make of the interaction we just had. The second we stepped outside and looked towards the gas pumps, we saw the same 2 friends we had just seen standing behind us. The one who was entering the bathroom was leaning casually against the car, while the one who gave us a sinister look was finishing up pumping gas. My female friend and I were dumbfounded and asked them how they were standing in front of us when they were both just behind us a few seconds ago, and they looked at us like we had multiple heads. After paying for gas, the 2 immediately went back out to the car, as the gas station gave off too weird of a vibe to wait in there for us. Sufficiently creeped out, we piled back in the car and noped the fuck out of there. I'm not sure why we saw 2 of my friends' doppelgangers in a gas station, or why the doppelgangers seemed to be in such a pissy mood, and I'm really not sure why the gas station had a collection of farm animal statues outside of it. I'm pretty content never going there again though. That place definitely should not exist. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe.